I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was early enough for Oxford to seem deserted, a hush before the day's pedantry began. I walked without purpose across Merton Street, the drizzle steady, thin as breathed mist, and felt the cobbles take on that slick sheen that makes a man tread with care. My shoes carried the smell of last night's rain into the folds of my coat. I had no appointment. I rarely do at that hour. There is a peculiar consolation in wandering a city that has known you since your boyhood illusions and watched each of them recede. Under the chestnut trees, a woman sat feeding pigeons from a paper cone. She might have been a remnant from an old photograph. Grey hair pinned with absent-minded precision, a gown too heavy for her small frame, its velvet worn to a sheen at the elbows. I noticed how she dropped each crumb not as an offering, but as if testing gravity, her hand hesitant, uncertain. She looked up when I passed. "You are Morse, aren't you?" she said, as though naming me were no more than recalling a forgotten rhyme. I stopped. Rain ticked on the iron bench beside her, a narrow thing painted green but chipped to rust. She told me she had found a man's coat there the previous night. "Still warm," she said, though no one was near. She spoke this last detail as one might recount a half-remembered dream, neither frightened nor eager to be believed. I sat down, aware of the faint damp seeping through my trousers. She unfolded a handkerchief and smoothed it on her knee. The pigeons retreated in a small semicircle, necks tilting like question marks. I asked her what sort of coat. She described it as dark, heavy, with a college badge half torn from the lining. She had taken it to her lodging on Holywell Street, thinking to deliver it to the porter this morning, but then thought better. Something about its warmth unsettled her. Her voice was low, unhurried. She had once been a lecturer in medieval Latin, but no longer taught. The gown was habit, she said, not privilege. I found myself studying her shoes, cracked but polished. She spoke of the coat's smell, tobacco, and river water. She had not seen the man's face, only the coat, abandoned in a hurry. I asked the usual questions. Did she know which college the badge belonged to? Had she noticed footsteps, a bicycle, anything unusual? Each answer was a soft negation. "No," she said, but the bench itself had been warm, as though another body still hovered there. I wrote this detail in my notebook, though I did not need to. A bell from the chapel at Oriel struck the quarter hour. I felt a shift in the morning, as if the city had inhaled. My mind, almost against my will, began to run along its familiar grooves. A coat left warm suggested haste, but not necessarily flight. In my head, a half-formed crossword clue began to flicker. Absent scholar's garment retains warmth. 5. Habit, perhaps. Cloak, gown, or ghost. I looked at her hands again. On her left glove, a thread of blue wool had caught, the kind one finds in a college scarf. I let the observation settle. She seemed to sense my notice and folded her hands together, hiding the thread. The pigeons came closer now, emboldened. She said she had taught at Lonsdale once, years before. A small college, easily overlooked. She asked if I would like to see the coat. I told her not yet. Better to bring it to the station later. For now, I only wanted to stand and breathe the wet air of Merton Street. The smell of stone, rain, and a faint ghost of tobacco lingered there. We parted without formality. As I walked away, I turned once to see her still scattering crumbs in careful arcs, the pigeons shifting like grey punctuation marks around her feet. In the distance, the spire of Magdalen blurred into the drizzle. I thought of coats hung in empty rooms, of chairs still warm after a conversation ends. There are absences, I reminded myself, that hold more weight than presence. And somewhere behind the steady fall of rain, a detail already trembled at the edge of meaning, waiting for me to remember it. Lewis arrived just after noon with the coat draped over his arm, as though it might leak some invisible residue. I remember the room smelled faintly of damp wool and pipe smoke, though no one had been smoking. The station on such afternoons holds its own sort of echo, the muted clatter of typewriter keys from another office, the hiss of a kettle not yet boiling. He laid the garment across my desk with a care I had not seen him use with evidence before. It was heavy, dark, the kind one imagines on a man accustomed to waiting out long services in cold chapels. I opened it slowly. Rain-stiff fabric resisted my hands. In the inner pocket, a folded college timetable pressed flat like a pressed leaf. Its paper was slightly translucent, worn at the creases. I recognized the Lonsdale crest, but no name. Beneath it, tucked without ceremony, a half-finished crossword torn from the Times. My eye went at once to the line scribbled above the grid, a fragment from Tennyson, but not quite right. To strive, to seek, to yield, and not to find. The last verb altered, as if by a tired mind or a deliberate signal. No wallet, no keys, no card to anchor the coat to a person. The absence struck me harder than the items themselves. Lewis muttered that perhaps the man had simply mislaid it. Perhaps. But the warm bench, the hastily left garment, and now a misquoted poet. These were not the gestures of mere forgetfulness. I flattened the timetable and studied the markings. 3 lectures circled in pencil, all in the same cramped hand, one already crossed out. Tuesday chapel, Wednesday seminar, Thursday nothing. The crossword clues were half done, some inked confidently, others left blank. One caught my attention. Cloister shade, 5. The answer space empty. I wrote mentally, bower, arbor, cellar, or ghost. A small flicker of meaning touched the back of my mind, but withdrew. Lewis said a porter from Lonsdale had rung. Claimed he'd seen a man last night, near the chapel, wearing a coat like this one. Couldn't remember the face. The light was poor, he said. Too much drizzle. Too much dark. He thought the man had hesitated at the chapel door, then turned away. Lewis relayed all this without lifting his eyes from the coat, as though the cloth itself might confess. I asked him about the porter's voice. Did it sound rehearsed or uncertain? Lewis shrugged, said only that the man spoke slowly, as if weighing each word. That in itself was a detail. Porters know faces the way scholars know footnotes. To forget one is an act of will. The coat lay between us like a puzzle without edges. I ran a finger along its torn lining. A single thread of blue clung there, perhaps from a scarf, perhaps nothing. The fabric smelled of river water, tobacco, and the faintly metallic scent of cold stone. It reminded me of evenings spent outside chapel doors when I was young, listening to music I did not understand but longed for. Lewis asked if he should send it to the lab. Not yet, I said. Better to keep it close until the name rises from the paper. He looked at me with that expression he wears when he thinks I'm chasing shadows. Perhaps I was. But shadows have their own logic in Oxford. I folded the timetable back into the pocket, careful to keep its creases aligned. The misquoted line stared at me like an unfinished thought. To yield and not to find. A deliberate inversion? A tired slip of the pen? Or a message to someone who would notice the change? I told Lewis to bring me the porter's full name and to find out who taught the lectures circled on the timetable. He nodded, lifting the coat once more, heavier now with unspoken questions. As he left, the room grew quiet again except for the ticking of the clock above the door, a sound like rain dripping from a high gutter. I sat back and closed my eyes. A man had stood near a chapel last night and turned away. A coat had remained warm on a bench. A crossword half-finished lay folded in its pocket. Each fact separate, like stones scattered on wet grass. Yet somewhere between them a path waited, faint as chalk under drizzle, for someone patient enough to see it emerge. I remember entering Lonsdale College as one steps into a painting hung in a dim corridor, the frame narrowing of vision, colors subdued until the eyes adjust. Rain clung to my coat in small translucent beads. The porter, a man of indeterminate age with the patient expression of someone who has stood watch for decades, guided me through the gate without ceremony. Inside, the quad held its breath. Grass cut low and wet, stone walls silvered by drizzle, windows clouded from within. A bell tolled somewhere beyond, not for me. I paused beneath the cloister. The arches smelled of lime wash and old sermons. On a ledge, a lone pigeon blinked at me, its claws clenched on a rusting drain pipe. I thought of the crossword clue left blank, cloister shade, 5, and wondered if the answer waited here. Arbor. Maybe, or ghost. The college seemed both. Dr. Phoebe Latimer received me first in her rooms above the chapel passage. She was younger than I had imagined from her publications, but carried herself like someone already weary of praise. Books lay in neat columns on her desk, spines turned inward, titles concealed as though privacy extended to paper. She spoke of Carew, lightly, with a scholar's courtesy, saying she had glimpsed him once in the quad but could not be sure. Her hands did not rest. They moved papers a fraction this way, a fraction back. When I mentioned the misquoted Tennyson, she only tilted her head, an almost imperceptible wince at the corner of her mouth, then asked if the coat smelled of the river. That was all. Crossing the quad again, I noticed the sound my shoes made on the flagstones, a muted hollow echo like footsteps rehearsed behind a door. Professor Charles Denholm's room stood in the older wing, oak door darkened by generations of hands. He opened it before I knocked. Tall, spare, with hair cropped so close it seemed carved. His office bore none of Phoebe's clutter, only a single oil portrait of a previous bursar and a row of ledger books as rigid as soldiers. He assured me Lonsdale had nothing to conceal. Carew, he said, had left Oxford years ago and was remembered only dimly. Yet as he poured me a small glass of sherry, unasked, I saw his eyes travel to the timetable folded in my pocket as though recognizing its handwriting. He asked whether the police still solved crimes by newspapers and hunches. I told him sometimes we solved them by noticing who asked which questions. In the stairwell down, I met Alistair Quinn. He seemed almost relieved to encounter me, though his words moved carefully, like someone crossing a frozen pond. A young lecturer in Renaissance poetry, burdened with debts he did not mention but wore in the sag of his shoulders. He claimed he had spoken to Carew briefly last week about an obscure translation of Pindar. No, he said, he had not known Carew was back in Oxford. No, he did not know why the man might visit the chapel after dark. But when he handed me his card, it was damp at one corner, as though it had been in a pocket beside wet cloth. I wandered alone for a while after the interviews. The college had grown quieter, the drizzle a fine mist now. I traced the cloister again, fingers grazing the stone. A cracked window above the library caught my eye. Behind it, a lamp burned low, casting the outline of a bust. Perhaps Virgil, perhaps someone else. A blurred head watching me without interest. In the porter's log, I found a trivial entry, a delivery of wine to the senior common room at the same hour the coat had been left on Merton Street. A coincidence, perhaps, but I wrote it down. Beneath my notes, I scribbled the crossword clue once more. Cloister shade, 5. I tried ivy, arbor, altar. None satisfied. Then I wrote ghost and left it there. As I stepped back into the street, the gate closing with a slow, metallic sigh, I felt the weight of the coat still in my mind, as though I carried it draped over my own arm. Lonsdale had shown me its polite face. Books turned inward, sherry poured without request, damp cards passed from cold pockets. Yet in each exchange, something had been withheld, like a word dropped from a poem so the rhyme falters. Rain gathered in the gutters, carrying down leaves and fragments of pigeon feathers. Somewhere in the unseen chapel, a chord was struck on the organ, low and unresolved. I walked on, knowing only that the college had offered me 3 voices, each quiet, each evasive, and that between them a silence had begun to take shape, darker than the cloister itself. The senior common room at Lonsdale was one of those spaces that wore its age discreetly. Afternoon light slanted through tall windows dulled by decades of condensation, catching dust in long, pale threads that looked almost deliberate. A fire hissed softly in the grate, although it was hardly cold enough to warrant one. The room smelled of cracked leather, lemon oil, and the faint, elusive perfume of something burnt long ago. I had been invited to wait there while Lewis searched for the librarian, but the invitation felt like an experiment in patience. On the far wall hung the usual college relics: watercolors of the chapel in various seasons, a faded print of dawn, and, above the mantel, a black and white photograph in a narrow oak frame. I walked toward it without thinking. 12 young men in rowing kit stood shoulder to shoulder on the riverbank, eyes squinting into a sun no longer there. Their expressions were solemn but not severe, the sort of seriousness one adopts when youth has not yet been tried. One face, third from the left, caught me, not for any distinguishing feature but for the absence of one, a blank composure that seemed to invite projection. I stared until the image blurred, as though the photograph itself might soften under scrutiny. My memory reached back. A winter evening at the opera, a performance of Verdi, the second act when the curtain rose on a dim stage, and I had glanced across the aisle at a man whose stillness was almost theatrical. He had worn a coat with the collar turned up, and when he applauded he did so with a kind of inwardness, as though only he heard the music correctly. The fire cracked, returning me to the present. In the glass of the frame, my own face looked back, older and less certain, superimposed upon the rowers. The name beneath the photograph had faded to pale grey. Only a few letters could be read. Care. Something. Later, in a corner of the college bar, I poured myself a solitary glass of claret. The bar was empty at that hour. Chairs stacked near the window, a drip of rain sliding down the pane like a slow metronome. The wine was thin but adequate. I let it settle on my tongue and thought again of the man at the opera. Simon Carew. The name rose unbidden, as if summoned by the echo of the photograph. A man who had left Oxford under a shadow, some scandal whispered, but not printed. A man who might return in disguise of familiarity, hoping the college's memory had grown as dim as the ink beneath the frame. The librarian found me there. She was a spare woman with a voice like tissue paper, soft but precise. She said she had heard about the coat. The porter believed it belonged to Simon Carew, though nothing was certain. He had been seen near the chapel a few nights ago, standing at the door and then walking away. She added, almost as an afterthought, that Carew had once been a promising scholar of minor poets, adept at finding the wrong word in a right place. Her phrase lingered with me, the wrong word in a right place. I thought of the misquoted Tennyson scrawled on the crossword, to yield and not to find. Carew had always been a man of minor alterations, she said, as though describing an architectural flaw no one had remedied. She adjusted a stack of catalogues on the counter while speaking, aligning the corners with delicate severity. I asked her whether Carew had friends still at Lonsdale. She hesitated long enough to become an answer. "No one of consequence," she murmured. "Only debts and faint resentments." Then she turned away to reshelve a folio, her back straight, the set of her shoulders telling me she had said as much as she intended. When she left, I remained with my glass, watching the rain collect in small convex pools on the outside sill. In the half-light, the room seemed to tilt, as if I were once again in the opera house, scanning a sea of faces for one fixed point. The photograph upstairs and the man across the aisle merged in my mind until they were indistinguishable. I set the empty glass down without sound. The echo of the librarian's words, the wrong word in a right place, joined the faint drip of rain and the ache of claret on an empty stomach. It was not yet evidence, not even a clue, only a flicker on the edge of meaning. Still, as I walked back into the quadrangle, I felt certain of one thing. The man in the photograph had begun to watch me as closely as I had watched him. Lewis came in quietly, as though the coat itself had asked for silence. He laid it on the table and, without looking at me, said he had felt something stiff inside the lining. I watched his hands move along the seam, patient, almost tender, until a corner of paper emerged like a pale wing. It was an envelope without stamp or seal, the flap tucked but never closed, addressed simply to C.L. in a woman's hand, the loops deliberate but restrained. I took it from him. The paper held a faint trace of perfume, not floral but dry, like leaves stored in a drawer. Inside lay a single sheet, creased twice, the writing slanting uphill as though fleeing its own message. Only 4 lines, part of a poem perhaps, but they did not rhyme. The syntax was clipped, a code or a warning. The river holds what the chapel denies. The shadow of the fen bends twice. 3rd bell after none. Speak only in absence. I read it aloud in a low voice. Lewis shifted on his feet but said nothing. C.L. could have been anyone. A name, a college, an alias. My mind turned to Phoebe Latimer. I'd seen the tremor at the corner of her mouth when she spoke of Carew. The coded poem's cadence was classical, yet not academic, a private echo of some lost translation. I folded it back into the envelope and felt the seam of the coat again, as if more messages might bloom there. Nothing else. Later that afternoon, I asked Phoebe to meet me in the cloister walk. The rain had stopped, but left the stones slick. She arrived with a folder under her arm, as though our conversation were a seminar. I told her about the letter, reading one line softly. The river holds what the chapel denies. For a moment she stood as still as the statues in the niches, her face drained of its careful color. Then she looked past me to the damp lawn and said she knew nothing of any letter, that Carew had been a difficult man and many people disliked him. Her voice was even, but she gripped the folder too tightly, the cardboard bending slightly at one corner. I let her words drift away without contradiction. Her reaction was more revealing than any confession. The code might be simple, a set of cues only 2 people could decipher. Or perhaps nothing more than Carew's habit of minor alterations, his way of turning a familiar text inside out. When she had gone, I remained under the cloister. The crossword clue I had written in my notebook, cloister shade, 5, flickered again. The answer might be crypt or umbra or something else entirely. The river holds what the chapel denies. I wrote the phrase beneath the clue. Sometimes meaning arrives sideways, like rain blown under a door. That evening in Denholm's rooms the atmosphere felt heavier than before. The bursar poured whiskey into 2 glasses without asking. He listened as I described the letter, his expression composed but his thumb rubbing the rim of his glass in small circles. He said Carew had enemies, many of them earned through academic disputes. He mentioned plagiarism, defamation, old debts. The words came out like items in a ledger, not accusations. I asked him whether he recognized the initials CL. He shook his head slowly, said only that the college kept too many ghosts to name them all. His eyes traveled to a file on his desk, but did not linger. He spoke of Carew's talent for provocation, his delight in drawing out people's weaknesses. If someone wished him harm, Denholm said, it would be less a surprise than a relief. I finished the whiskey and left before the silence thickened. Outside, night had crept fully into the quad. A single lamp glowed by the library door, casting a narrow beam onto the wet grass. I stood there, feeling the envelope in my coat pocket, aware of its perfume and its weight. The river holds what the chapel denies. 3rd bell after none. In the distance, a bell struck the hour, then another, out of sync. A pattern, perhaps, or only the echo of old mechanisms failing. I thought again of Phoebe's pale face, of Denholm's thumb circling his glass, of Carew's unfinished crossword. Each detail a fragment, like lines of a poem cut from its context. I walked on without haste. Some letters remain unopened, not because they are forgotten, but because they are read too clearly before they are ever sealed. The call came just after dawn, a time when Oxford smells less of learning and more of wet stone and the faint tang of riverweed. A student had seen a body near Folly Bridge, he said, a dark shape sliding under the punting poles like something already belonging to the water. By the time the river patrol arrived, nothing remained but a swirl of disturbed reeds. The mist lifted slowly, leaving only a vague indentation on the surface where the eye had tried to draw a man. I stood on the bank watching the punts knock against one another with small, hollow sounds. The Thames, or the Isis, depending on who claimed it, moved sluggishly, carrying silt and secrets past the colleges. A porter told me the gossip had already begun. Simon Carew had drowned himself, tired of debts and disgrace. Rumour in Oxford travels faster than the river, and often with less accuracy. I walked along the towpath where the wet grass had been pressed flat by night wanderers. The smell of algae rose with each step, a thin green note that clung to my coat. On the far bank, a row of houseboats sat shuttered, smoke curling from one thin chimney. I thought of Carew's misquoted Tennyson, to yield and not to find. Yield indeed. The word felt heavier here. Lewis joined me with a flask of tea he knew I would not drink. He said Quinn wanted to speak. We found the young lecturer waiting near the boathouse, his hair damp, eyes bright with something between fatigue and resolve. He began, without preamble, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the river's hiss. Carew had accused him of plagiarism, he said, an article on Pindar submitted under both names, the dispute still unresolved. He swore he had not harmed the man, that he had only wished for a final judgment. The phrase hung there. Final judgment. He used it twice, once as if quoting Carew, once as if quoting himself. It was not a student's idiom. It sounded like someone rehearsing a verdict. I watched his hands as he spoke. They were clean, but his nails bore thin crescents of mud. He kept glancing at the water as though expecting it to echo him. I asked him where he had been the previous night. He recited an alibi, the times too precise to be remembered so quickly. He looked past me toward Folly Bridge when he said it. Behind him, a punt bumped gently against the mooring post, the rope creaking. Lewis jotted something in his notebook, but I did not. Some details are better stored in the mind where they can shift and align themselves without ink's insistence. We walked together back toward the college. Quinn spoke of Carew in the past tense now, as if the man were already gone. He said the accusation had ruined his chances at a fellowship, that he had tried to meet Carew to resolve it, but the man refused. He used another phrase, washed his hands of me, and immediately looked down at his own hands. Small gestures, but telling. At the edge of the meadow, a heron stood motionless, its neck folded, eyes fixed on the shallows. I paused and let the others walk ahead. In my notebook, I wrote only a single line, F.J. twice. Then beneath it, the crossword clue from days before. Cloister shade, 5. It was still unsolved, though now another answer suggested itself. Crypt, a place where things are hidden but not lost. By the time I returned to the boathouse, the mist had thinned to nothing. The river looked empty, almost innocent, as if it had never held a body at all. The houseboats on the far bank showed no sign of movement. A gull lifted and dropped a feather into the current. Back at Lonsdale, the rumours had already hardened into story. Carew drowned. The porter repeated it with a certain relief, as though a problem had solved itself. I said nothing. In Oxford, disappearance is rarely a clean escape. It is more often a reshuffling of shadows. That evening, alone in my rooms, I set Quinn's words beside the photograph in my mind, beside the letter to CL, beside the misquoted poem. A body glimpsed but not retrieved, a final judgment invoked but not rendered. Each piece lay separate, like stones across the riverbed. Only the current bound them, invisible and patient, waiting for me to step across. I went to the library that morning, not out of duty, but from an instinct as old as my first case. The sense that paper keeps its own pulse, faint but measurable. Lonsdale's library lay at the back of the quad behind an arched door whose keyhole had been worn oval by centuries of turning. Inside, the air was cool and fibrous with dust, carrying that particular scent of polished wood and dried ink. The boards creaked under me like muted sighs. Lamps cast yellow halos on the reading tables, though no reader sat at them. I'd asked the librarian for Hardy's poems of past and present, a first edition bound in a heavy green cloth. She brought it without question, her gloves pale against the darker cloth. When she retreated, her footsteps dissolved into the hush. I opened the book at random, letting the pages whisper. Near the middle, a gap broke the rhythm. A page had been neatly razored out, leaving only the narrowest thread of binding. The absence looked deliberate, like a tooth removed from a closed mouth. On the verso of the preceding leaf, at the margin, a faint inscription had been penciled. I bent close. The graphite had smudged slightly, but the hand was recognizable. Angular, leaning forward, the same as on the crossword tucked in the coat. A fragment of verse not Hardy's own, but a distorted echo. The fen bends twice, chapel denies river, third bell after none. The same phrases from the letter to CL, but rearranged as if someone had been testing permutations. I felt a flicker at the edge of comprehension, a code sliding toward alignment and then receding. I wrote the lines into my notebook and closed the book carefully, aware of its weight like a sealed container. Someone had taken that missing page not to destroy, but to carry it, perhaps as proof, perhaps as leverage. The inscription suggested a rehearsal of the message, not the message itself. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, his coat still wet from rain, his hair unsettled. He had been at the bursar's office. He said Denholm had authorized a withdrawal from the college's discretionary fund, a sum large enough to be noticed even in Oxford, where numbers sleep beneath endowments. Officially, it was for restoration of the library's roof. But the roof above me showed no sign of recent repair. No scaffolding, no tarps, no smell of fresh timber, only the soft decay of woodworm and time. He handed me a photocopy of the ledger entry. The signature was Denholm's, but the date coincided with Carew's return. Lewis looked at me as though expecting outrage. I only nodded. In this city, money moves in circles as quiet as any cloister. Its noise is absence. I asked him to describe the bursar's manner. Calm, he said, but too ready with explanations. He had mentioned Carew's name before Lewis did, as though rehearsing his own defense. That detail I wrote down. Words offered before their question often tell the truest story. I wandered deeper into the stacks after Lewis left, following the smell of old bindings. My fingertips brushed spines, the gold letters dulled to a shade between brass and ash. In a corner alcove, a single reading lamp burned, though no one sat there. On the desk lay a slip requesting retrieval of the same Hardy volume I held. The handwriting was Phoebe Latimer's. I stayed there for a long while, listening to the rain strike the leaded windows. The college clock chimed once, then again, slightly off, as though two mechanisms were at odds. The third bell after none. I thought of the heron by the river, of Quinn's nails lined with mud, of Denholm's thumb circling his glass. Each fragment a word in a poem whose page had been removed. I closed my notebook and slid it back into my coat. Somewhere, the missing leaf of Hardy's book traveled in someone's pocket like a concealed passport, carrying its marginal verse from one room to another. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist, and the quad looked newly washed, its stonework glistening like the inside of a shell. I stepped out, feeling the library's hush cling to me like a scent. Some absences declare themselves more vividly than presents, and that morning the gap in Hardy's book seemed louder than any line left behind. I remember the house in Summertown as a kind of muffled echo. Tall hedges, shuttered windows, and a bell that chimed once without conviction when I pressed it. The retired singer lived on the top floor, though she had not sung publicly for years. A caretaker led me up a narrow stair lined with old programs and yellowing reviews. The air smelled of beeswax and faintly of stage makeup, a sweetness already fading. She received me in a parlor that might once have been bright, but now had curtains drawn against the mid-morning glare. Her hair, silver and arranged with deliberate looseness, formed a frame around a face still bearing the memory of applause. She motioned me to a chair without speaking, then sat opposite with her hands folded on a velvet cushion as though on a score. Her voice, when it came, had lost its resonance but not its control. She said she remembered Simon Carew. Everyone did, though some preferred not to admit it. I asked her when she had last seen him. She smiled in a way that felt more like a stage direction than a reaction. "Years ago," she said, "at a rehearsal in the college chapel. He had been charming, reckless, convinced that scholarship could be conducted like an aria, with ornament and risk." Her eyes drifted toward a photograph on the mantelpiece. A young man at a piano, blurred, his head bent. She said she had heard rumors of an affair between Carew and a student, a girl with a gift for Latin elegiacs. It had been quietly suppressed, she murmured, the college preferring shadows to scandal. Her words fell without emphasis, but I watched the movement of her hands. Each time she mentioned the student, her fingers tapped once on the cushion, like a muted beat before a high note. She would not give a name. She only said the girl had left Oxford abruptly, leaving behind a library card and a half-finished translation. I quoted to her a fragment from the letter hidden in the coat. "The shadow of the fen bends twice." And she looked at me with sudden, clear recognition. Then she looked away, saying only that Simon liked to play at doubling himself. He had kept, she recalled, a second coat identical to the one everyone knew him by. An old academic prank, she called it, ghosting oneself. He would hang one coat in the senior common room and wear the other to slip unseen into places. She said it with the kind of amusement one uses for a story already souring in memory. I let the silence grow until it seemed part of the furniture. On a side table lay a small glass paperweight shaped like a swan. Beneath it, a scrap of music handwritten in faded ink. The notes formed a motif that repeated, then inverted itself. A mirror theme. I thought of Carew's misquoted Tennyson, of the rearranged phrases in Hardy's margin, of the two coats, one seen, one unseen. She asked whether Simon was in trouble. I told her only that a coat had been found, and rumors of drowning stirred the river. Her shoulders lifted slightly, then settled. "He was always rehearsing his disappearance," she said. "Like an encore he might never give." She spoke of him fondly, but without defense, as if fondness itself were an old costume she had put on for my benefit. As she talked, I noticed a book propped on her piano, Hardy's Poems of Past and Present. Its pages bore no gaps, but a slip of paper marked one poem whose title she had underlined. I did not read it aloud. Some details are better left dormant until the right chord strikes. When I rose to leave, she accompanied me to the stair. Her perfume, faint, dry, like paper pressed with herbs, clung to the banister. At the door she said softly that Oxford forgets quickly, but never forgives. Then she turned back toward the dim parlor without looking over her shoulder. Outside, Summertown felt too bright after her drawn curtains. The pavements glistened from an earlier shower. I walked slowly, thinking of ghosts that are not spirits but duplicates, coats hung to suggest a presence while the man himself slips elsewhere. The crossword clue I had been worrying, cloister shade, 5, flickered again. Phantom would not fit, but ghost did. Perhaps it was no longer a clue, but a warning. I headed back toward the center, the city's spires lifting pale against a sky beginning to clear, carrying with me the singer's muted voice and the echo of a motif inverted, waiting for its resolution. I sat alone in my rooms that night with the coat folded across the back of a chair like an uninvited guest. Rain worked at the window panes with small, persistent fingers, the sound uneven, like an old clock missing a tooth. I had spread the half-finished crossword on my desk beneath the lamp, its ink already fading to a pale gray. The squares, empty or half-filled, resembled the cloisters at Lonsdale viewed from above, symmetrical but holding shadows. My eyes returned again and again to the line scrawled across the margin, Carews' hand misquoting Tennyson, to strive, to seek, to yield, and not to find. That last verb had irritated me for days, a single false note in an otherwise perfect aria. Tonight, perhaps because of the rain or the stillness, I traced the initial letters of each word as though the pen's path might show me what the mind had missed. They formed a neat little ghost of a word, F-E-N. I leaned back and let the letters settle. Fen, marshland, concealment, a place where things sink out of sight. But also Fensome. The name drifted up from some forgotten footnote of conversation, a hidden trust established years ago in Denholm's name, whispered among the college staff as a discretionary reserve. Money that moved without ledger entries. I reached for the ledger Lewis had photocopied, its neat columns of figures, and circled the date of the withdrawal. It matched precisely the night the coat had been found on Merton Street. I poured a small measure of whiskey and let the heat travel slowly down. The crossword lay open, squares glinting faintly under the lamp. I began filling in the few clues Carew had left blank, not to solve them, but to see the pattern of his omissions. Cloister shade, 5, still empty. River's curve, 4, unanswered. Third bell after none, a scribble in the margin shaped like a chapel arch. He had been building a private map disguised as a puzzle. I thought of Denholm's thumb circling his glass, of Phoebe's pale face when I quoted the poem, of Quinn's mud-lined nails, all of them moving within the college like actors who had learned only their own lines. The coat's discovery at that hour, warm still, had not been chance. It had been a signal. In the quiet, I heard the faint creak of floorboards from the flat above mine, a tenant shifting in sleep. The sound reminded me of the chapel's wooden stalls, the way they echo the smallest movement. I took out my notebook and drew 2 columns. On the left, the time circled on the timetable found in the coat. On the right, the chapel's schedule Lewis had obtained from the verger. The coat appeared on Merton Street at precisely the moment a secret meeting had been scheduled in the chapel, a meeting unlisted on any public calendar. I traced the columns with my pen until the ink began to feather. Carew had been on his way to that meeting or away from it. Perhaps he had staged his disappearance to coincide with it. Perhaps someone else had. The trust, the coat, the crossword, the missing page from Hardy, each a sliver of a larger shape still beneath the waterline. Outside, the rain slackened to a mist, softening the street lamps into small amber moons. I closed my eyes and pictured the cloister at Lonsdale empty under that light, the arches like silent staves of music waiting for notes. F-E-N, Fensome. Fenland. Hidden wealth in marshy ground. A man could vanish there, at least on paper. I filled in the crossword square by square until only the central clue remained blank. Cloister shade, 5. My pencil hovered. Ghost still would not fit, nor crypt. Umbra, perhaps. Or fen. I wrote fen lightly, just to see it. It slid perfectly into place, aligning the down clues like vertebrae. I sat back and listened to the room breathe. Somewhere a bell chimed once, then again, slightly out of time as though rehearsing a code. I left the puzzle open on the desk, its pattern now resembling the floor plan of the chapel. Nothing resolved, nothing explained, only a faint direction in which to walk. When I turned off the lamp, the coat's outline remained visible in the dark, a shape waiting to be filled. The chapel at Lonsdale is never truly dark. Even at midnight, a residue of candle smoke clings to the rafters, catching what little light seeps through the high windows, and the organ pipes stand like a row of sentinels watching their own silence. Lewis and I waited in the south transept, backs against the cold stone, our breath muted by the echo. Outside the rain had stopped, but the gutters still whispered. I felt the familiar tug of whiskey in my pocket and did not reach for it. We had entered by the vestry door shortly before 11. The verger's key turned reluctantly, metal on metal. Lewis set up a small torch on the floor, its beam directed toward the marble steps. We spoke in undertones, but even undertones traveled here like rumors. I told him to watch the north aisle. Denholm would come that way if he came at all. The minutes stretched, marked only by the slow drip of water from a cracked drain pipe into a stone basin near the choir stalls. My eyes adjusted to the half-light. Stained glass saints stared down without expression, their colors dulled to gray. I thought again of the crossword, of FEN aligning the clues, of money sliding through marshy ground. Somewhere above the roof, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Then silence returned as though pulled over us like cloth. A faint scrape, then another. Denholm appeared at the far end carrying a cardboard box, the sort used for archival papers. He moved without stealth, but with the composure of someone performing a necessary task. At the altar rail, he set the box down and removed a sheaf of documents bound with string. He struck a match, cupping it carefully, and fed the first pages into a brass brazier used for incense. The flame rose uncertainly, licking at figures and signatures. I stepped forward from the shadows, my voice low enough to belong to the building. "That will do, Professor." He started, but did not drop the match. Lewis moved to my side, his torch glancing off the columns. Denholm straightened, the firelight making a brief mask of his face. He said the papers concerned only financial irregularities, his words measured, unhurried. The trust had been mismanaged, he admitted, but Carew had left Oxford alive. He had met him, yes, but only to settle accounts. I watched his hands as he spoke. They rested too lightly on the brazier's rim, fingers extended as though in benediction. His voice lacked the tremor of a man cornered, more like an administrator explaining policy to a committee. He even smiled once, a thin reflex of courtesy. Before I could press him further, the vestry door opened, and Phoebe Latimer stepped inside, her gown catching at the hinge. She looked as though she'd been standing in the rain, though the sky outside was clear. She said she had come to pray, but her eyes moved first to Denholm, then to me. She spoke quietly, admitting she had been Carew's confidant, that she had helped him with his research and sometimes his letters. She denied harming him. Her words fell into the space between us like small stones dropped into deep water. Lewis glanced at me but said nothing. The air in the chapel thickened with the smell of scorched paper and something older. Candle grease, damp hymnals, the faint musk of robes hanging in the vestry. I asked Phoebe how she had known to come at this hour. She lowered her gaze, murmuring that she often walked here at night when sleep eluded her. Denholm stood impassive, the brazier's flame reduced to a glow. He offered to hand over the remaining papers if we wished. His tone was that of a man concluding a meeting rather than facing inquiry. I felt the tableau settling too neatly around me. The bursar, caught but unafraid. The scholar confiding yet untouched, the chapel's shadows holding their breath. I wrote a single word in my notebook. Ghost. Not as an answer, but as a prompt. The coat, the crossword, the two coats, the missing page, the secret trust. The meeting at midnight. All present yet absent, like a figure glimpsed in stained glass, then lost when you shift your head. We left the chapel just before 1. The sky above the quad had cleared to a brittle blue-black, stars pricking through like pins in a map. Behind us, the chapel door closed with a slow echo. I did not speak to Lewis. The night smelled of cold stone and charred paper. Some scenes, I thought, arrange themselves with such symmetry that one almost believes them. Almost. The porter's statement had sat in my notebook for days like a half-solved clue. Each time I read it, I skimmed over the same words, assuming their meaning fixed. That morning, with the chapel's ash still in my coat and the echo of Denholm's calm voice lingering, I read the lines again. He had said the man near the chapel door carried a coat. Not wore, carried. And then a second coat was mentioned almost in passing, as if describing luggage. 2 coats. I underlined the words until the paper went thin. I walked back through the misted quad toward the porter's lodge. He was polishing the brass rail with a cloth darkened from years of repetition. When I asked him to repeat his memory, he shrugged, eyes sliding toward the chapel windows. He had seen a figure put 1 coat on the rail, he said, and another draped over his arm. He thought it a curious affectation, but said nothing at the time. He was sure now. 2 coats. Outside, the air smelled of river mud and burned paper, a combination that felt both ancient and new. 2 coats. Ghosting oneself, the singer had called it. Carew had rehearsed his own vanishing act, intending perhaps to frighten Denholm into payment or confession. But the coat left warm on Merton Street had been a signal too obvious. A lure. Someone had followed the pattern and closed the gap. Lewis met me at the river's edge near the boathouse. The water lay dark and flat, reflecting a sky that held no sun. The boathouse had been shut for months, a sign nailed to the door about renovation that never began. Its roof sagged under moss. I told Lewis we were going in. He frowned, but did not argue. Inside smelled of damp wood and rope. The faint sourness of oars left wet too long. Dust motes drifted like muted applause above the boats stacked against the walls. At the back, under a canvas tarp, lay what looked like a mound of old rowing cushions. The air shifted as we approached, a silence heavier than any I'd felt in the chapel. I lifted the edge of the tarp. Beneath it, the second coat lay folded on her, body curled into itself as if still braced against the cold. Simon Carew. His face slack, a bruise blooming at the temple. The smell of river water clung to him, though the boards beneath were dry. In his hand, stiffened, a scrap of paper torn from Hardy's missing page. Only a fragment of verse remained, unreadable where the ink had run. Lewis stood back, arms crossed, saying nothing. I crouched there, the damp seeping into my knees, feeling the echo of every clue gather like condensation on glass. The 2 coats, the misquoted poem, the trust in Denholm's name, the midnight meeting. Carew had staged his disappearance, but someone had stepped into his script and written the last act differently. I examined his shoes, mud from the chapel path, but also a smear of green silt, fresh, as though he had been dragged or lured from the river bank before being hidden here. No sign of a struggle, only the blow. The coat still smelled faintly of tobacco and incense. He had not been dead long when the body was brought in. I looked up at the rafters, the ropes hanging like unplayed notes, the crossword clue I had been carrying, cloister shade, 5, whispered again. I wrote the word phantom in my notebook, though it did not fit the grid. Perhaps the grid itself had changed. Lewis asked if we should call it in. Not yet, I said. The boathouse felt like a theater after the audience has gone, sets still in place. Actors vanished. Some details needed to be left untouched until their meaning rose on its own. We stood there a while longer. Outside, the river kept its slow pace, carrying silt and whispers under Folly Bridge. In the distance, a bell struck noon, then another, slightly out of time, like two versions of the same event overlapping. The return that never was. When we stepped back into the light, the air smelled of wet grass and something metallic. I carried with me the sense of a man who had tried to double himself and succeeded only in becoming absent. The coat left warm on Merton Street was no longer a clue, but an elegy. She asked to meet me in the cloister before dawn. The rain of the night had dried to a faint sheen on the stones, and the sky above the quad was colourless, neither night nor morning. I walked there slowly, my coat heavy with damp air, aware of the echo of my own steps between the columns. When Phoebe emerged from the passage, she was without her usual folders, her hair unpinned, her face set with a stillness that looked rehearsed. She did not speak at first. We walked together toward a bench beneath the chapel window. The smell of candle grease drifted down from an unseen vestry. The college seemed to be holding its breath. She sat, clasping her hands so tightly the knuckles whitened. She said Carew had threatened her, that he had promised to expose a youthful affair with a student unless she helped him press Denholm for money. She spoke in a low, level voice, the words neither plea nor defense. I let her continue without interruption. She described how she had written the letter to CL under Carew's dictation, how the coded poem had been his idea, a way of proving she still obeyed him. She had lured him to the boathouse under the pretense of delivering Denholm's payment. She said Quinn had appeared unexpectedly, that Carew had taunted him about plagiarism, about the fellowship slipping away, and that the taunting had turned into shouting. She did not see the blow, but heard the thud and the silence after. Quinn had knelt beside Carew as if to lift him, but found only stillness. Her eyes never left the damp stones at her feet. She said she had wanted to call for help, but Quinn had begged her not to, his hands shaking, the river mist rising around them like a curtain. Together they had dragged the body inside, hidden it under the tarps. She had not returned until the night of the chapel stakeout, when she saw Denholm burning papers and realized how neatly the pieces had been rearranged. She told me all this without weeping, only once pressing her fingers against her temple as though steadying a faint sound. I listened. In her pauses, the cloister's silence pressed close, filled with the small crackle of a sparrow hopping along the gutter. I asked whether Quinn had struck him deliberately. She said she did not know. Carew had always enjoyed rehearsing other people's collapses. Perhaps he had pushed Quinn to the edge out of boredom. She did not excuse herself. I thought of the crossword, of the missing page in Hardy, of the two coats. Each device had been a way of doubling, of moving off stage while leaving a prop behind. Ghosting oneself, she'd called it. Now the ghost lay real in the boathouse, and the players stood blinking in the daylight. I did not arrest her. Not then. I only wrote in my notebook a single phrase, "Youth's debt unpaid." She noticed, but did not ask. When she rose to go, she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, a small gesture of dignity, and walked back toward the passage without looking behind. I remained on the bench until the chapel bell tolled the hour. The sound traveled across the quad in uneven waves, as though two clocks were trying to strike the same note. Light began to creep across the stone, pale and hesitant. Students would soon emerge with their books and their ambitions, unaware of the night's confessions. I left the college through the side gate, passing the porter's lodge where the brass rail caught the first glint of sun. The streets of Oxford were washed clean from the rain, and a milk van rattled over the cobbles with a sound like distant applause. My hands were cold, but I did not put them in my pockets. As I reached the end of Merton Street, I thought of the coat left warm on the bench, of the second coat folded over Carew's body, of ghosts rehearsed and choices rehearsed again until they harden into fact. Some absences, he thought, are warmer than presents.